"Daddy, they said I'm trash." The words cut sharper than any blade, but what this single father did next left an entire classroom in stunned silence. Before we dive in, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that carried no warning signs. The sky was clear, the sidewalks warm beneath the late sun, and Mark Rivera leaned against his old pickup with the quiet patience of a father who had learned to measure life in school bells and aftercare schedules. He expected the same sight he always got: Emily running toward him with her backpack sliding off one shoulder, hair sticking out from the braid she'd unraveled during recess, a granola bar half chewed, and a brand new story spilling out of her mouth before she even buckled in. But when the doors opened and children spilled out, laughter echoing, Emily did not bounce. She trudged, small sneakers dragging against the pavement as if every step weighed double. Her head hung so low he almost didn't recognize her until she was right in front of him. Her eyes were rimmed red, swollen from crying, though her cheeks were dry now, as if she'd run out of tears before she reached him. Mark felt something seize in his chest. He dropped to one knee, setting his rough hands gently on her shoulders. "Hey, baby," he whispered, forcing his voice soft, steady. "What happened?" She didn't meet his eyes. She clutched something tight in her fists, paper, crumpled, edges damp from her grip, and then she whispered it, so quietly he almost didn't hear. "Daddy, they said I'm trash." The words sliced clean through him, sharper than anything he'd endured in years. He had lived through heartbreak, through the long nights after his wife's illness, through the dull ache of raising a child alone, but nothing had prepared him for this. He blinked, steadied himself, swallowed down the anger that rose like bile. "Who?" he wanted to demand. "Why?" His instinct was to march straight into that building, to find the child who had dared to hurt her, to demand answers from teachers who should have protected her. But something stopped him. It wasn't her words. It was her hands. Her small fists clutched that paper like a life raft, knuckles white, refusing to let go. This wasn't just a complaint. It was evidence, a wound made visible. He softened, pried gently at her fingers. "Can I see?" For a moment she resisted, shaking her head, tears threatening to return. But then, slowly, she loosened her grip. The page unfolded in his hands. He looked down and felt his throat tighten. It was her art. A phoenix rising from flames, wings outstretched, fire curling into the sky in bold, uneven strokes of orange and red. The proportions weren't perfect, the lines wavered, but it was alive. He could see it, could feel it, the way only a child could draw, with honesty, with unfiltered imagination. And scrawled across the image in crude, heavy red marker was one word: garbage. Mark froze. He stared at that word until the edges blurred, until the page trembled in his hands. It wasn't just vandalism. It was violence, the kind of violence that leaves no bruise but breaks something fragile inside a child. He looked back at Emily. She wasn't watching him. She was watching the ground, as if bracing herself for his reaction, as if she half believed the word might be true. He wanted to tell her it wasn't. He wanted to rip the paper to shreds and scream that she was brilliant, radiant, irreplaceable. But he knew better. Words weren't enough right now. What she needed wasn't a speech. It was proof in his eyes, in his touch, in his silence, that no marker, no cruel laugh, no careless hand could define her worth. So he folded the drawing carefully, smoothing its wrinkles as best he could, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he stood, lifted her backpack onto his shoulder, and offered her his hand. "Let's go home," he said softly. She looked up at him, hesitant, but placed her hand in his anyway. As they walked toward the truck, he could feel her small palm trembling against his. His mind churned with a storm of fury and helplessness, but beneath it all was something else, a vow forming in the quiet of his chest. This would not be the end of her phoenix. This would not be the moment she believed lies written by someone too blind to see her fire. Mark didn't know how yet, but he knew one thing. He would not let his daughter carry that word like a scar. He would show her what he saw every time she picked up a pencil. And one day, the world would see it too. The kitchen carried the smell of simmering beans and warm rice, the kind of meal that usually coaxed Emily into chatter about her day. The light above the table hummed faintly, casting a soft glow over chipped plates and the worn wooden chairs Mark had fixed more times than he could count. Normally, dinners were their ritual, their anchor. Emily would kick her feet against the chair, humming as she sketched while he cooked, sometimes darting over to show him a half-finished dragon or bird before running back to her seat. Tonight was different. Tonight she sat stiffly, her small body folded in on itself, elbows on the table, chin nearly touching her chest. Her untouched plate sat in front of her, steam curling upward like it was waiting for permission that wouldn't come. She wasn't looking at the food. She was staring at the crumpled drawing lying flat between them. The phoenix, once a symbol of fire and rebirth, now looked like a ghost. She didn't reach for it, didn't tear it, didn't even push it away. She just stared, her eyes glazed as though she was silently willing the red word to vanish. Garbage. It clung to the page like a wound that refused to heal. Mark hated the quiet. He hated it more than any insult, more than any problem at work, more than any overdue bill waiting on the counter. Emily had always been a child of noise, sketching, humming, laughing. Her silence filled the kitchen with a heaviness he couldn't escape. He cleared his throat and tried the first thing that came to mind. "You know," he began, spearing a bean with his fork, "Mr. Peterson at work tripped over a mop bucket today. Full water. Went flying. I thought the man was auditioning for the circus." He forced a chuckle, even pantomimed arms flailing. "Nothing." Emily blinked, but her gaze didn't leave the drawing. He leaned back, tapped the table with his fingers. "Want to hear the one about the janitor who accidentally set off the fire alarm because he was chasing a raccoon out of the supply closet?" He leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Spoiler, it was me." Her lips twitched. Maybe. But then she dropped her eyes again, shoulders curling tighter. Mark took a breath. Last resort. He tapped his fork against the glass, started humming off-key before letting words tumble out in a shaky mock serenade. "Beans, beans, magical fruit." He sang louder, dramatically, his voice cracking on purpose. Normally she'd burst out laughing, hands over her ears, begging him to stop. Tonight she didn't even smile. Defeat seeped into him. He let the song fade, set his fork down, and rubbed his hands over his tired face. For a long moment he just watched her, the way her small hand hovered over the drawing but never touched it, like it might burn her if she tried. He leaned forward, lowering his voice so it was just between them, like a secret. "You're not trash, baby." She finally looked at him, eyes wide and wounded. He held her gaze steady, gentle. "You're the spark they don't understand yet." That's all. Her lower lip trembled. She whispered, barely audible, "But they all laughed." Those 4 words landed like stones on his chest. He remembered laughter like that, cruel and sharp, the kind that strips you bare in front of everyone. He had lived through it once, in his own childhood, but seeing it weigh on her was unbearable. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice not to break. Sometimes people laugh when they're afraid of something they can't do themselves. Doesn't mean it isn't worth doing. But she shook her head, folding in tighter, retreating into the kind of silence that felt more dangerous than anger. He sat back, helpless, staring at the little girl who carried his wife's eyes, those deep brown pools that once brimmed with warmth and certainty. He hadn't felt this powerless since the hospital nights 4 years ago, when machines beeped softly and the woman he loved slipped away despite every prayer, every whispered bargain he tried to make with the universe. Back then, silence had become his companion. It had haunted him, filled the empty side of the bed, walked with him through every grocery aisle and work shift. But this silence, his daughter's silence, was worse. Because this wasn't just grief. This was identity. This was a 9-year-old child being told by the world that her light wasn't worth shining, and if she believed it now, she might carry it forever. He saw the danger like a shadow creeping toward her, the same one that had smothered his own music when he was her age. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let that happen. Mark clenched his jaw, steadying himself. Something deep inside whispered, "Do something. Anything. Don't let her forget who she is." He didn't know what yet, didn't know how to fight cruelty that sneaks in through laughter and careless words. But he knew this. He would not let his daughter grow up thinking she was garbage, not when he saw fire in every line she drew. He reached across the table, resting his calloused hand gently over hers. Still small, still trembling. She looked at him again, and this time, though her eyes were glassy, she didn't pull away. For that moment the silence shifted, not broken, not gone, but softer. And he promised himself that one day she'd rise like the bird she'd drawn, and the world would be forced to see her for what she was. Fire. The apartment was still, the kind of stillness that settled only after a child's breathing slipped into the slow rhythm of sleep. Emily lay curled beneath her blanket, her sketchbook tucked tightly against her chest like a shield, as if letting it go might mean letting the day win. Mark had checked on her twice already, smoothing her hair back, whispering words she couldn't hear, hoping they would sink into her dreams anyway. Now he sat alone at the kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound, the single overhead bulb casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. The Phoenix drawing lay in front of him, edges wrinkled, colors dulled by fingerprints, the hateful red word slashed across it like a wound. He turned it over, ran his calloused finger across the grooves pressed into the paper, as if touching it could erase the pain it carried. Garbage. One word, written without thought, but capable of tearing through his daughter's heart. His throat tightened. He knew too well the weight of words like that. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as memories bled into the room. The ghosts of his own childhood crept in, uninvited but merciless. He could still hear the teachers who dismissed him, voices sharp with impatience. Hopeless, one had muttered when he failed another math test. Lazy, another had declared when he handed in a paper smudged with eraser marks. But the word that stuck the most came not from teachers, but from peers. The boys who shoved him into lockers, the girls who wrinkled their noses as he passed by. Worthless. Because his shirts came from second-hand bins, because his shoes carried the smell of detergent that wasn't Tide, wasn't fancy, just whatever his father could afford on a mechanic's paycheck. He remembered the day he walked into high school with his guitar, the one he had begged his father for, the one his old man had worked overtime shifts to buy. It had felt like carrying a dream in his arms, strings glinting under the hallway lights. He thought maybe, just maybe, he could show them he wasn't what they said, that his hands could create something beautiful. But the laughter came before he ever played a note. Snickers about his out-of-date guitar strap, jeers about how he thought he was some kind of rock star. He had frozen, cheeks burning, and by the time he reached class, the dream had already started to collapse inside him. He played a few times in secret after that, late at night, when no one could hear. But soon, even that faded. He let their voices bury his music. The guitar gathered dust in the attic until it became part of the clutter, a relic of a self he had abandoned. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with his daughter's wounded drawing before him, he felt that same old ache press against his ribs. Except this time, it wasn't his pain that mattered. It was hers. And the echoes of his past had found their way into her present. She was only 9, already holding fire in her hands, already sketching creatures that looked like they might fly off the page, and yet someone had tried to crush it with a single word. His jaw tightened. Not this time, not with her. He refused to let history repeat itself. He would not watch Emily bury her gift the way he had buried his. She deserved more than survival. She deserved to believe in the fire she carried. He picked up the drawing once more, studying the phoenix rising through the flames. Its wings stretched wide, unsteady but defiant, trembling but unbroken. He traced the lines her small hands had made, felt the determination hidden in the shaky strokes, the kind of determination no child should have to summon. She was already fighting battles she didn't understand, battles he should have shielded her from. Mark pressed the paper flat on the table, smoothing its creases as though restoring it could somehow restore the faith his daughter had lost. His chest swelled with a quiet vow. He would fight for her. He would stand between her and every careless word, and he would make sure she knew, beyond doubt, that her art was not garbage. It was light. It was fire. It was proof of something bigger than cruelty. The refrigerator hummed. The bulb flickered once before steadying again. Mark exhaled slowly, shoulders heavy but resolve unshakable. His daughter's future would not be written in red marker. Not while he still had breath in his body. The morning air was sharp, the kind that made every breath feel like glass. Mark walked Emily to her classroom door, bending low to kiss the crown of her head before she slipped inside. She gave him a small, uncertain smile, the kind that looked borrowed, not real. He watched her disappear into the hallway, clutching her sketchbook like armor, and then turned away with a heaviness that grew heavier with every step. His boots echoed down the linoleum floors until he reached the front office. He asked to see the principal, his voice steady, though every nerve in him burned. The secretary barely looked up from her computer, waved him toward the chair, and told him to wait. Mark sat, Emily's drawing folded neatly in his bag. He felt it there, pressed against his side, as if it carried its own pulse. When the door finally opened, Principal Harris appeared, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a tie that looked tired even before noon. His handshake was limp, his expression perfunctory, like Mark was just another inconvenience between emails. The office smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Papers stacked in uneven piles across the desk, Post-it notes clinging to the edge of a monitor. Mark stepped forward and didn't bother with small talk. He pulled the drawing from his bag and laid it down flat on the desk, smoothing the folds with the same care he might use for a wound. "This was written on my daughter's drawing," he said quietly. His voice carried weight, though it was barely above a whisper. Harris glanced at the paper, the word garbage slashed in thick red marker across the phoenix. He didn't flinch, didn't pause, just sighed, as though he'd seen it all before, and said, "Kids can be cruel." Mark's jaw clenched. He felt the words like sparks on dry tinder. "Cruelty isn't supposed to be ignored," he said, sharper this time. His hands curled into fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms. The principal leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers over his stomach. "We'll remind the students about kindness during morning announcements," he replied, with the kind of detachment that made Mark's blood boil. "It usually helps for a while." Mark stared at him, heat rising to his face. Remind them? His daughter's tears were not something solved with a polite reminder. Her belief in herself, cracked and fragile, was not something that could be patched with a few lines read over a loudspeaker. He thought of Emily sitting silent at the dinner table the night before, staring at her drawing like it was cursed. He thought of her whisper, "They said I'm trash," and felt fury climb his throat. "This isn't about announcements, Pussoo," he said slowly, his voice low but trembling with the force of everything he was holding back. "This is about my daughter being humiliated, about a child being made to believe she's worthless because you don't want to see what's in front of you." Harris frowned, shifted in his chair, but the indifference didn't lift from his eyes. "Mr. Rivera, I understand your concern, but unfortunately this is part of growing up. Children have to learn resilience. We can't shield them from every unkind word." The word struck Mark like a slap. He leaned forward, his voice steady but cutting. "She's 9. Resilience doesn't mean letting her believe she's garbage. It means having at least one adult who tells her she isn't. Silence filled the room, thick and charged. Harris's gaze flickered briefly, but then he reached for a pen and scribbled something onto a notepad, signaling the meeting was over. "We'll handle it," he said, tone final. Mark looked down at the phoenix, its wings spread defiantly, even under the insult scrawled across it. He felt something shift in him then, a cold clarity slicing through the anger. He knew this man wasn't going to fight for Emily. The school wouldn't protect her. They would file the cruelty away under "kids will be kids" and move on. Mark picked up the drawing, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into his bag. He stood without another word, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles burned. As he walked out of the office, the fluorescent lights above seemed harsher, the hallways narrower. But inside his chest, something was sharper than rage, resolve. If the school wouldn't fight for her, he would. The evening light stretched long across the small living room, turning the walls golden as the sun dipped behind the buildings outside. Emily sat curled on the couch, her knees tucked up, sketchbook balanced against them. Her pencil moved, but not with the confidence it once had. She would draw a few lines, hesitate, then erase them until the page was ghosted with smudges. Her brows knitted tight, lips pressed into a thin line. From the kitchen, Mark watched, pretending to busy himself with rinsing dishes he'd already washed. Every scrape of her eraser felt like sandpaper against his chest. It wasn't the quiet that unnerved him. Emily often got lost in her drawings, hours disappearing into dragons, birds, and castles only she could see. It was the hesitation, the way she no longer trusted her own hands. He wiped his palms on a dish towel and leaned against the counter, just watching her. The television sat silent, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. He wanted to break the stillness with a joke, with music, with anything, but he didn't. Something told him she needed the silence, even if it felt heavy enough to choke him. Finally, she stopped. Her small shoulders sagged. She turned her head toward him, her eyes wide and unsure in a way that cut deeper than anything she could say. "Daddy," she whispered, "am I really any good?" The question gutted him. It wasn't curiosity. It was fear, a plea. He swallowed hard, forced his voice not to break as he crossed the room and sat down beside her. For a moment he just looked at the sketchbook in her lap. Faint outlines of wings erased so many times they seemed to blur together. He reached for her pencil, his big fingers clumsy against the small wooden shaft, and drew a shaky line beside hers, crooked, uneven, almost laughable. "See this?" he said, tapping the page gently. "That's my line." He drew another, worse than the first. "Ugly, right?" Emily's lips twitched, but she stayed quiet. "Baby," he continued softly, handing the pencil back, "art isn't about good or bad. It's about telling the world what only you can see. No one else has that but you." Her chin wobbled, her eyes shimmered, filling but not spilling. "But what if the world doesn't like what I see?" Mark inhaled sharply, steadying himself. He reached for her small hand, folding it into his rough palm. Her fingers felt fragile, but they gripped him like she was holding on for dear life. He squeezed gently. "Then the world will catch up," he whispered. For a long beat, the words just sat between them. Then, slowly, her lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't wide, it wasn't free like before, but it was real. And in that small smile, Mark felt something ignite deep in his chest. A fuse lit, steady and unstoppable. He studied her face, memorizing the curve of that fragile smile, because he knew it was borrowed time. Doubt had already taken root in her, planted by cruel laughter and careless hands. If she questioned her worth now at 9 years old, what would stop her from burying her gift completely? He had buried his own once. He knew exactly how easy it was to let the world convince you that your light wasn't needed. Not again, not with her. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, letting his hand linger just a moment longer. "You are extraordinary, Emily," he said quietly, so firmly it sounded like an oath. "And I'll make sure you never forget it." She leaned against him, small and warm, her sketchbook slipping to the side. Her breathing steadied, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. Mark stared at the smudged page still open, the ghost of a phoenix lingering beneath eraser marks. In that faint outline he saw more than a drawing. He saw fire waiting to be set free, and in that moment he knew. If the world dared to doubt her, he would make them see. She wasn't trash, she was everything, and he would prove it. The night pressed down heavy on the apartment, the kind of silence that stretched long after the city had gone quiet. Mark lay on his back, staring at the ceiling as shadows from the streetlights cut across the walls in pale stripes. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face at the dinner table, the way she had asked him if she was any good, the way her voice had cracked on the word good like she already feared the answer. He saw her small shoulders bent over that sketchbook, erasing, doubting, shrinking. And behind all of it, he saw that cruel word, scrawled in red marker, garbage. His chest ached with anger and helplessness. What could he do? He had already bought her the best supplies he could afford, markers and pencils and stacks of paper, even when it meant skipping lunch at work to make up the cost. He had spoken to the teacher once before about kids being unkind, but that conversation had ended with a polite nod and no real change. The principal had been worse, dismissing the cruelty as kids being kids. No, that road was a dead end. He turned onto his side, the thin mattress groaning beneath him. Emily's door was cracked open, and he could see the faint glow of her nightlight spilling into the hallway. She slept curled around her sketchbook as if it were the last safe place left in the world. Mark's throat tightened. He remembered when she used to run to him after school, shoving pages into his hands, her eyes bright as she explained every detail. Why the dragon had 3 horns, why the castle had vines creeping up its towers, why the bird's wings stretched wider than the page could hold. She hadn't cared if the lines were messy, if the colors bled outside the borders. She drew like the paper couldn't contain her. That light in her eyes was the truest thing he'd ever seen, and now it was dimming. The thought made him sit up suddenly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His heart pounded. What if the world saw what he saw? What if strangers, people outside that classroom, looked at her drawings and saw brilliance instead of mockery? What if she realized her vision wasn't small or silly, but something powerful enough to reach people she'd never met? That was it. That was the answer. It wasn't enough to tell her she was extraordinary. She had to feel it, see it reflected back in the eyes of others, not the bullies, not the principal, not the narrow world that had already tried to label her. Everyone. He would make her art impossible to ignore. Mark pushed himself to his feet and paced the room, the plan forming piece by piece. He didn't know how yet, whether it would be through a local gallery, an art contest, or maybe even something online, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Emily's gift was going to be seen. He would hold her work up to the world until it had no choice but to recognize it. The word garbage would be burned away, erased not by his insistence, but by proof, by strangers leaning in close to admire her colors, by judges nodding at her bold lines, by people she didn't even know being moved by the fire she poured onto paper. That was how she would believe again. That was how she would rise, like the phoenix she had drawn. He stopped at the window, looking out at the city lights blinking in the distance. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes shadowed by years of struggle, but tonight there was something sharper there, resolve. He had failed to protect his own dreams once, letting them wither under the weight of laughter and doubt. He would not fail hers. Mark returned to bed but didn't lie down. He sat on the edge, elbows on his knees, whispering into the quiet, almost like a vow. "They're going to see you, Emily. They're going to see you." And for the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope flicker to life, steady and certain. The plan was born. The morning air was cool. the kind that carried a quiet sharpness before the sun had fully claimed the sky. Mark drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, stealing glances at Emily in the passenger seat. She sat with her backpack on her lap, straps pulled tight, her sketchbook wedged between her knees, as though letting go of it might mean losing more than just paper and pencil. Her gaze stayed fixed on the blur of houses and storefronts outside the window, lips pressed into a thin line. Mark's chest ached at the sight. She had been quiet all morning, no chatter about the dreams she'd had, no questions about whether he thought dragons were stronger than lions, none of her usual rambling that made the drive feel shorter. Silence from Emily always meant something was weighing on her. When they pulled into the school parking lot, he let the engine idle for a moment. Kids streamed past in little clusters, laughing, backpacks bouncing, sneakers squeaking across the pavement. Emily didn't move to unbuckle her seatbelt. She just stared at the entrance like it was a gate to something she wasn't ready to face. Mark leaned closer, his voice soft but steady. "Hey," he said. "What if people could see your art outside of this classroom?" Her brow furrowed, and for the first time that morning, she turned to look at him. "Like who?" "Like the whole town," he answered carefully, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened, the kind of widening that was equal parts wonder and fear. She hugged the sketchbook tighter to her chest. "They'd laugh at me." The words came out quick, defensive, as if she'd already rehearsed them in her head. Mark's throat tightened, but he forced himself to smile. "Or," he countered gently, "they'd see the fire I see." Emily didn't reply. Her fingers traced the edge of her sketchbook absent-mindedly, nails biting into the cardboard cover. For a moment he thought she might argue again, tell him he was wrong, but instead she pressed her lips together and turned back toward the school. "Time to go?" she whispered, as if the conversation had grown too heavy for the small space of the truck. Mark nodded. "Yeah, time to go." She unbuckled her seatbelt and slid down from the seat, the oversized straps of her backpack nearly swallowing her frame. As she adjusted it on her shoulders, he noticed something different. She held her sketchbook against her side, tucked tight, almost like a shield. Not hidden, not abandoned, guarded. She walked toward the building with her head down, but her steps had a faint determination, a small thread of resolve woven through the nervous shuffle. She clutched her sketchbook tighter than usual, and Mark saw it, that subtle shift, the way she carried it as if she understood on some level that it mattered too much to let go. He stayed in the truck, watching her until she disappeared inside. The morning bell rang, echoing faintly through the parking lot. Only then did he exhale, long and heavy. He knew it wouldn't happen overnight. Confidence wasn't something he could hand her like a new set of pencils or pack into her lunchbox with an encouraging note. It would take time. Time for her to believe her voice mattered. Time for her to see her drawings not as paper marked with mistakes, but as windows into a world only she could build. Until then, he would hold the belief for her. He would carry it in his chest, steady and unyielding, until she was ready to carry it herself. Mark started the engine, gripping the wheel a little tighter, his jaw set with quiet determination. He had buried his own dreams once. He wouldn't let her do the same, not while he still had strength to fight for her fire. The apartment was quiet except for the faint scratch of a pencil against paper. Emily sat at the kitchen table, bent over her homework, her brow furrowed in concentration. The lamplight caught the soft strands of her hair, making her look smaller somehow, fragile but determined. Mark sat a few feet away with his old laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He typed slowly, careful not to draw her attention. Children's art competitions near me. Dozens of results filled the page. He scrolled, heart sinking as he clicked one after another. Entry fees, $25, $40, sometimes even $100, numbers that might not look like much to some families, but to him meant groceries, meant rent, meant the electricity bill staying paid. He rubbed his temples, frustration pressing against him. He could clean a dozen more floors, scrub 100 more toilets, but right now, tonight, the numbers didn't add up. Still, he kept looking. He thought of the way Emily had clutched her sketchbook that morning, the way her eyes had flickered with fear when he mentioned showing her art to the world. If he gave up now, what would that say? That the cruel red word on her drawing had the final say? Number. He couldn't let that be her story. And then, tucked between the links for expensive contests and glossy galleries, he saw it. Community Center Youth Art Exhibition. Theme, Rise. He clicked quickly, pulse kicking up as the page loaded. Free entry, ages 6 to 16, all mediums welcome. The description spoke of celebrating creativity, of giving children a platform to share their vision. And the theme, Rise. He almost laughed out loud. Rise. It was as if the contest had been waiting for her. The phoenix she had drawn, wings outstretched through fire, wasn't just a picture. It was the perfect answer to that theme. He could see it hanging there already, could see strangers stopping to look, leaning in, whispering to each other about the boldness in the colors, the honesty in the lines. Mark sat back, staring at the screen, his chest tight but alive with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He glanced at Emily. She was still hunched over her math worksheet, lips moving silently as she worked through the problems. She hadn't noticed his quiet flurry at the computer. He smiled faintly. She didn't know yet. He pulled the drawing from his bag, smoothing it gently across the table beside him. The word scrawled across it was still there, still ugly, but tonight it didn't sting the same way. Tonight, the word wasn't final. It was fuel. He reached for his phone, snapped a picture, and carefully uploaded it into the submission form. His fingers shook slightly as he typed her name, Emily Rivera. When he hit submit, his heart pounded like he'd just done something reckless, something daring. Maybe he had. He wasn't just entering a contest. He was staking a claim for his daughter's future, planting her fire where the world couldn't ignore it. He closed the laptop slowly, almost reverently, and sat in the quiet for a moment longer. Emily looked up, pencil between her teeth. "What are you doing?" she asked, curious. "Just work stuff," he lied gently. She nodded and bent back to her homework, trusting him without question. Mark exhaled, a shaky breath that carried with it both nerves and determination. He wasn't naive. He knew not every contest ended with ribbons or applause. But this wasn't about winning. This was about standing up against that one cruel word, about giving Emily proof that her art was worth more than the laughter of careless kids. He glanced at her again, so small at the table, yet carrying worlds in her hands every time she picked up a pencil. Someday, he thought, she'd understand what he had done tonight. Someday she'd know this wasn't just a contest. It was the first step toward the future she deserved. The smell of toast and scrambled eggs filled the kitchen, the kind of simple breakfast Mark had made 1,000 times before. Emily sat at the table in her pajamas, her hair sticking out in every direction, a spoon in one hand, and her sketchbook balanced near her elbow. She absent-mindedly stirred the cereal in her bowl, not really eating, her mind still heavy with the weight of yesterday. Mark watched her for a moment from the counter, then reached into his jacket pocket, where he had folded the flyer the night before. His heart gave a quick, nervous beat. He set the paper down gently on the table, sliding it across the wood until it rested just inches from her hand. Emily froze, her spoon hovering midair. She blinked at the flyer, confusion flashing across her face. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious, as if bracing for something she didn't want to hear. Mark sat down across from her, his gaze steady. "A chance," he said simply. "I entered your Phoenix." Her eyes widened instantly, color rushing to her cheeks. "Daddy, no!" The spoon clattered into the bowl, milk splashing up the sides. "You can't!" "What if they laugh at me?" He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, speaking in the calm, even tone he used when she was younger and afraid of thunderstorms. "Then they laugh," he said gently. "But if they don't..." If they see what I see, you'll never forget it." Emily's hands flew to the flyer. She picked it up, reading the bold letters. Community Center Youth Art Exhibition. Theme, Rise. Her eyes darted across the page, drinking in every word as if it might change under her gaze. "Rise," she whispered. Like my phoenix." Mark nodded. "Exactly like your phoenix." She shook her head quickly, her braids swinging. "But Daddy, what if I lose?" Her voice cracked on the word, so small, so afraid. Mark reached across the table, gently taking her hand in his. He leaned closer, his eyes steady on hers. "Then we learn. But you don't lose by trying, baby. You only lose if you stop before you even begin." She bit down on her lip, chewing nervously, as if his words were too big to swallow all at once. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, slowly, she folded the flyer, creasing the edges carefully, almost reverently, and slipped it into the pocket of her sketchbook. Mark's chest tightened. That single motion told him more than words could. She hadn't rejected it. She hadn't thrown it away. She had claimed it, tucked it into the one place that mattered most to her. She looked up at him, her voice quieter now. "Do you really think I'm good enough?" His throat tightened, but his answer was steady. "I don't just think it, Emily. I know it. And one day you'll know it too." Her small fingers traced the cover of her sketchbook, lingering over the spot where she had hidden the folded flyer. For the first time in days, he saw the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. Uncertainty still, but mixed with a fragile thread of hope. She didn't smile, not fully, but her shoulders softened, the tension in her frame easing just a little. Then she reached for her spoon again and took a bite of her cereal, as if the conversation had exhausted her, and she needed something normal to ground herself. Mark sat back, watching her quietly. He didn't push. He didn't need to. The seed had been planted, and for now, that was enough. He knew belief took time, knew the road ahead would be filled with doubts and questions, and maybe even more cruelty from kids who couldn't understand her fire. But she had tucked the flyer into her sketchbook, and that meant she was willing to carry the chance with her. He finished his coffee in silence, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. She didn't know it yet, but the world was about to see what he had always known. His daughter was extraordinary, and no red marker could take that away. By Friday, the news had slipped through the cracks of Emily's classroom like a draft no one could block. Whispers ran along the rows of desks, exchanged in quick bursts during math problems, in half-hidden giggles behind library books, in the shuffling silence of lined-up hallways. The secret wasn't hers anymore. Somehow, word had spread that Emily Rivera had entered her Phoenix drawing into a real contest. Some kids sneered. They didn't need reasons. Cruelty rarely did. A girl with glitter pens rolled her eyes so hard her ponytail whipped over her shoulder. Another boy leaned across his desk during spelling and muttered, "Who'd even want to look at her weird birds anyway?" Laughter fizzed in low pockets around her, not cruel enough to draw a teacher's notice, but sharp enough to sting. But not every whisper carried venom. Some were curious. A pair of classmates leaned together and asked, "Do you think it's true?" Another boy, pencil tapping against his desk, whispered, "A real contest? Like judges and stuff?" The idea carried weight, like maybe entering meant something bigger than the classroom walls. And then, just before lunch, it happened. A boy with a smirk, one of the loud ones, the kind who always made sure everyone heard him, called across the room, "Trash girls in a contest?" The words hung in the air, jagged and hot. Emily froze. Her stomach tightened, every muscle begging her to shrink, to disappear into the desk, to swallow the humiliation before it swallowed her. She could already hear the laughter building, waiting for her silence to feed it. But something shifted. Maybe it was the memory of her father's voice the night before, telling her she didn't lose by trying. Maybe it was the flyer folded carefully in her sketchbook, riding in her backpack like a secret shield. Or maybe it was just that she was tired of believing someone else's word over her own. Her chin lifted, not high, but steady. Her voice came out small but clear. "Yeah," she said, "she is." The room went still for a beat, as if the air had lost its rhythm. The boy blinked, caught off guard. The laugh he had prepared never came. A few kids shifted uncomfortably, others just looked away. And in that pause, Emily realized something important. Not everyone was laughing, some were listening. The moment passed, but it didn't pass the same way moments used to. She didn't shrink this time. She stayed upright, her hands trembling beneath her desk, but her eyes fixed on the front of the room as though nothing had been said at all. That afternoon, when she slid into the truck, Mark could tell something was different. She was quiet, but not the heavy, suffocating quiet he'd grown used to in the past week. This was a quiet threaded with something else, something lighter. "How was your day?" he asked, pulling out of the parking lot. She looked down at her sketchbook, running her fingers over the worn cover, then glanced up at him with a small, almost secret smile. "They found out," she said. "About the contest?" She nodded. "Some of them laughed. One boy called me trash girl again." She paused, then added, her voice firmer than he expected, "But I told him." "Yeah, I am in it." Mark's grip on the wheel tightened, his chest swelling with something fierce and uncontainable. He glanced at her, and for the first time in days, her eyes weren't clouded. They were steady. Without thinking, he pulled the truck over to the side of the road, shifted into park, and turned toward her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a hug that spoke all the words he couldn't form fast enough. His voice cracked against her hair. "That's my girl." She giggled softly, muffled against his chest, and he felt the sound vibrate through him like music. It wasn't everything, not yet. The doubts still lingered, the shadows hadn't fully lifted. But in that small act of defiance, in those 3 simple words she had claimed for herself, Emily had stepped into something new. She was beginning to believe, just a little, and for Mark, that little was everything. The community center smelled faintly of paint and clay, the air buzzing with the hum of voices and the shuffle of sneakers against the polished floor. Bright posters covered the walls, welcoming families and young artists to the exhibition. Every surface seemed alive, tables lined with clay sculptures, canvases splashed with color, digital screens looping animations that pulsed with light. The entire space was bursting with imagination, and at the very center of it all stood Emily, clutching her phoenix drawing to her chest like it might fly away if she let go. Her eyes darted from piece to piece, widening at the polished landscapes, the intricate models, the vibrant murals far larger than her single sheet of paper. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve, "everyone's better than me." Her voice cracked, fragile as glass. Mark crouched down beside her, his hand steady on her shoulders. "Better doesn't exist," he said, his voice low but certain. "Different does. And yours is different." She blinked at him, chewing nervously on her lip, then looked back at the drawing in her hands. The phoenix's wings stretched across the page, its body rising through streaks of fire. The red word that had once haunted it was gone, erased by careful strokes and new layers of color she had added late at night when she thought he wasn't watching. Now it glowed with even more defiance, a creature refusing to be buried. "Come on," Mark urged softly. "Let's find its place." Together they walked to the display wall, where kids were pinning up their entries one by one. Some used colorful tape, others had frames or matting around their work. Emily hesitated as she watched the others, her grip tightening on the edges of her paper until it bent slightly. Mark gently straightened it in her hands, nodding toward an open spot near the center of the wall. "That's the one," he whispered. Emily's small fingers shook as she lifted the pushpin, but she forced it through the corner of the paper, then another and another, until the phoenix stood on the wall, wings outstretched among landscapes, portraits, and abstract bursts of color. She stepped back, her hands hovering awkwardly at her sides, as if unsure what to do now that it was no longer hers alone. People began to drift past, parents, kids, volunteers, each one pausing briefly at the rows of art. Some slowed to look at hers, their heads tilting, eyes narrowing in thought. A few moved on quickly, but others lingered. A man with gray hair and glasses leaned closer, murmuring something to his wife. A teenage girl smiled faintly before pointing it out to her younger brother. Emily stood very still, watching them, her breath held, as if waiting for the laughter to come. But none came. No one called it garbage. No one jeered. They looked, really looked. Mark watched the change in her posture, subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders, once hunched, began to straighten. Her chin lifted a little higher. She glanced at him, her eyes wide with something he hadn't seen in days. Not fear, but recognition. Recognition that maybe her father had been right. He gave her a small nod, no words needed. She turned back to the wall, staring at her phoenix as though she was seeing it for the first time. A volunteer with a clipboard passed by, smiling warmly. "Beautiful piece," she said to Emily before moving on. The words landed softly, but they stayed, settling into her like an ember catching flame. Emily's lips parted, the smallest smile tugging at them. She didn't say anything, but her hand lifted almost instinctively, brushing lightly over the edge of the paper pinned to the wall. For the first time since that red word had been scrawled across her drawing, she wasn't hiding it. She was sharing it. Mark stood behind her, his chest tight but light in a way he hadn't felt in years. He didn't need trophies or ribbons or even applause. This moment, the way her shoulders had straightened, the way her eyes had begun to shine, was the victory. Her art wasn't being laughed at. It was being seen. The days crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Every evening when Mark picked Emily up from school, she climbed into the truck with the same question perched on her lips before she even buckled her seatbelt. "Do you think they liked it?" He always answered without hesitation, his voice steady and sure. "I know they did." And every time she would nod, holding her sketchbook tight against her chest, as though his words were enough to keep her afloat for another day. But when the nights came and Emily was asleep, the weight of his answer pressed hard against him. Alone in the dim glow of the kitchen lamp, Mark would sit at the table with his head in his hands, doubt whispering in his ear. What if she didn't win? What if she wasn't chosen at all? He could handle disappointment, but Emily? She had only just begun to believe again. What would it do to her if hope was met with silence? He prayed, not for a ribbon, not for victory. He prayed for her to feel seen, for her art to be acknowledged even just once, so she would know her fire had value beyond the cruel laughter of classmates. He didn't need her to be first. He just needed her not to be invisible. Emily's restlessness mirrored his. She lingered over her drawings more than usual, flipping back and forth between pages, comparing lines, erasing, redrawing. Sometimes she caught him watching her and asked again, softer this time, as if afraid of the answer, "Daddy, are you sure?" And he always was, outwardly. But when he closed his eyes at night, his mind filled with the red scrawl of garbage, that word gnawing at the edges of his faith. By Thursday evening, the suspense had wound them both so tightly that the air in the apartment felt electric. Emily barely touched her dinner. Mark tried to distract her with stories from work, exaggerating mishaps with buckets and cleaning supplies, but her laugh never came. Instead, she pushed her rice around her plate, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, as though waiting for someone to come through the door with the verdict. Friday morning dawned gray and heavy with clouds. Mark dropped Emily off at school with a reassuring squeeze of her hand, masking the storm brewing inside him. He told her once more, "I know they did," and she gave him a small nod before disappearing through the double doors. Back at work, the hours blurred together in the hum of vacuum cleaners and the squeak of mops against tile. His phone stayed heavy in his pocket, every vibration making his heart leap. By mid-afternoon, his nerves were raw, his palms damp with sweat. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that the experience alone had already been enough, but when the call finally came, his world stilled. "Mr. Rivera?" a voice asked, formal but warm. "Yes, this is he. We're calling about Emily Rivera's submission to the community center exhibition." His breath caught. He leaned against the wall, gripping his mop handle like a lifeline. "Her piece was selected," the voice continued. Selected. The word nearly buckled his knees. He pressed a hand against his forehead, steadying himself as the details spilled out. Emily's Phoenix would be displayed at the main city gallery, alongside other chosen works, not just hung in a hallway of the community center, but elevated, celebrated, made part of something far bigger than either of them imagined. When the call ended, he whispered a hoarse thank you to no one in particular, to the universe, to God, to the memory of his wife watching from somewhere unseen. Tears stung his eyes as he stood there in the dim hallway of the building he cleaned every night, his reflection faint in the glass door, mop bucket at his side. This was bigger than he had dreamed, not because it meant prizes or prestige, but because it meant his daughter's fire had been recognized. Her Phoenix would rise where the world could see it. And when he picked her up that afternoon, when she asked again, "Do you think they liked it?" he would finally be able to tell her the truth. They didn't just like it, baby. They chose it. The gallery doors opened with a soft hiss, spilling light and voices into the night. Mark stepped inside first, his hand wrapped firmly around Emily's, guiding her across the polished marble floor. She walked with her shoulders hunched, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the tiles, her wide eyes darting from one side of the grand hall to the other. The ceilings stretched so high it felt like they might touch the sky itself, crystal chandeliers glittering above their heads like frozen fireworks. Men in tailored suits mingled with women in elegant dresses, laughter rising and falling in smooth waves, a language of ease that felt foreign to both of them. Emily squeezed his hand so tightly his knuckles ached. He glanced down and saw the tremor in her lip, the way her sketchbook, still clutched under her free arm, shivered with every step. She was small, out of place, and she knew it. But he bent down just enough for her to hear him over the hum of the crowd. "We're not here to look like them," he whispered. "We're here because of you." They walked slowly through the corridors lined with art, oil paintings bold with color, photographs framed in silver, sculptures frozen mid-motion. Emily's head swiveled from piece to piece, all mixing with unease. She clung closer to him, her voice no more than a whisper. "Daddy, what if mine looks wrong?" Mark's hand squeezed hers. "It won't. You'll see." And then they turned the corner. He felt her hand jerk in his before she froze entirely. Her breath caught. Her eyes widened. There, beneath the glow of gallery lights, hung her Phoenix, framed, elevated. Its wings spread wide across the page, fire curling skyward, every line she had drawn alive and defiant, and, beside it, a small placard with her name, Emily Rivera, age 9. For a long moment she couldn't move. Then the smallest sound escaped her, half gasp, half sob. She took one hesitant step forward, staring at her work as if it no longer belonged to her, as if it had grown into something larger the moment it was placed on that wall. Strangers stood in front of it, adults she had never seen before, murmuring to one another. One man in a dark blazer leaned in, his head tilted. "Powerful," he whispered. "So raw." A woman beside him nodded. "There's something fearless about it. Look at the way the wings cut across the fire. That's not timid. That's survival." Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. She looked up at her father as if asking permission to believe what she was hearing. Mark knelt down beside her, his voice low and steady. "Do you believe me now?" Her throat bobbed as she tried to swallow, her lips trembling with words too big for her small body. Finally, she whispered back, "I'm not trash." She lifted her chin, eyes shining. "I'm fire." Mark's vision blurred as he pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest. For the first time since this journey began, he felt the red word lose its grip completely, burned away by the glow of the phoenix hanging high for the world to see. When he let her go, she stepped closer to her artwork, no longer clutching her sketchbook like a shield. She stood taller, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her small shoulders squared in quiet pride. People kept coming, pausing, nodding, murmuring, and every time she overheard one of them, her breath steadied a little more. Mark stood behind her, his heart heavy with gratitude and fierce love. She didn't need a ribbon, she didn't need a title. This moment was enough. Her fire had been seen, and no one, not a careless classmate, not a dismissive principal, not even the ghosts of his own past, could ever take that away. Word traveled faster than Mark ever expected. By the time the gallery had been open for 2 days, people from across town were talking about the little girl who'd drawn a bird made of fire. Some said it was bold, others said it was haunting, and a few whispered that it was better than half the adult pieces on display. Emily didn't know what to do with the attention. Every compliment seemed to make her cheeks flush and her fingers fidget, but Mark could see the quiet pride blooming beneath her nervousness. On the third evening, as the gallery lights glowed soft against the marble floors, Mark spotted a familiar figure weaving stiffly through the crowd, Principal Harris. His suit looked uncomfortable, like he had borrowed someone else's authority to wear along with it. His shoulders were pulled too tight, his tie slightly crooked, and his lips pressed in that same thin line Mark had seen across the cluttered desk in the principal's office. Only this time Harris wasn't behind the safety of paperwork and policies. He was standing in front of a wall where Emily's phoenix blazed in full color, surrounded by strangers, murmuring words he had never offered her himself. The principal stopped. His eyes lingered on the painting longer than Mark expected, scanning the bold sweep of the wings, the stubborn fire beneath. Harris's lips pursed, but not in dismissal, more like he was trying not to admit what his heart already knew. Mark stood beside Emily, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She was watching Harris with a mix of nerves and curiosity, waiting to see if he would say anything. For a moment the silence stretched thin between them, broken only by the low hum of conversation around the gallery. Then Harris cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "Remarkable," he said at last. The word dragged out reluctantly, as though it had been forced from him. Mark could have taken the moment to gloat. He could have reminded the man of his sigh in the office, his shrug, his dismissal of cruelty as kids being cruel. But gloating wasn't what Emily needed. This wasn't about proving Harris wrong. It was about proving Emily right. So Mark smiled instead, calm and steady, and said, "That's what I've been telling you." Harris's eyes flicked to him, and for the first time there was no dismissiveness there, no tired authority, just acknowledgement. Then he looked at Emily, really looked at her, not as another name on a class list, not as one of dozens of students moving through the halls, but as someone who had created something undeniable. Emily didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She stood taller, her small shoulders squared, her chin lifted slightly, as if she understood that this moment had shifted something unspoken. For the first time Harris saw her, not invisible, not overlooked, seen. And in that quiet, undeniable moment, the word that had once tried to define her was gone, burned away, replaced by the truth glowing from the gallery wall. She wasn't trash. She was fire. And now even those who once doubted her had no choice but to recognize it. Monday morning carried a different weight than the ones before. The air was crisp, the hallway chatter the same. But for Emily, something had shifted. She clutched her backpack straps as she stepped through the school doors, her sketchbook tucked safely inside like always. Yet it didn't feel like a shield today. It felt like a promise. The whispers started almost immediately, rippling through the classroom before she even set her bag down. Heads turned. A few kids leaned toward each other, voices low but not cruel this time. "Was that really your drawing?" one girl asked, wide-eyed. Another boy piped up louder, "They put it in the city gallery? For real?" The questions hung in the air, buzzing with curiosity. Emily's cheeks flushed pink. She swallowed hard, unsure how to answer, but managed the smallest nod. That was all it took. A wave of chatter broke out, kids craning their necks to look at her, some with admiration, some with plain disbelief. "Wow," someone whispered. "That's crazy." "Mine never even gets on the bulletin board," another muttered. Emily shifted on her feet, half wishing she could disappear, half glowing with something she couldn't hide. The boy who had mocked her before, the one who had called her trash girl, sat slouched at his desk. For once, he didn't smirk. His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but no words came. He just stared, then looked away, tapping his pencil against the desk with forced nonchalance. The teacher clapped her hands, calling for order, and the room settled reluctantly. Emily slid into her seat, her heart still racing. She opened her sketchbook slowly, almost daring herself to do it in plain view. For weeks she had hidden it, only sketching when no one was looking, her body hunched over the paper like it was something shameful. Not today. She flipped to a blank page, laid her pencil against it, and let her hand move. A curved line. The suggestion of wings, the beginnings of something alive. Her classmates stole glances, but she didn't close it. She didn't hide. She kept drawing. Her confidence wasn't loud. She didn't announce anything, didn't boast, didn't meet every curious gaze with a challenge. It wasn't the kind of confidence that needed noise. It was the kind that settled into her bones quietly, the kind that no one could shake loose anymore. She felt it when her pencil carved shapes onto the page, when the lines flowed without hesitation. She felt it in the steadiness of her hand, in the calm that spread across her chest. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't drawing to prove something, not even to herself. She was drawing because it was who she was. A few kids leaned closer, trying to catch glimpses of her work. One girl smiled, then whispered, "It's pretty." Emily's hand trembled for half a second, but she didn't stop. She kept going, the small smile on her lips growing with each stroke. From the doorway, the hallway noise carried faintly, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, teachers calling for quiet. But in Emily's corner of the classroom, there was only the sound of pencil on paper, steady and sure. When the teacher walked past her desk, she paused for a moment, glancing down at the sketchbook. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing, just gave Emily a small nod before moving on. That nod, subtle and simple, felt like a door opening instead of closing. Emily's chest lifted with a quiet breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked at her drawing, half finished but alive, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't wonder if it was good enough. She already knew. The sun was slipping down behind the rooftops, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after a long day, when the world finally seemed to breathe out. Mark sat on the front porch, elbows resting on his knees, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. Beside him, curled on the wooden steps with her sketchbook balanced on her lap, Emily drew with a concentration so fierce it seemed to anchor the fading light. Her pencil moved in steady strokes, pausing only when she tilted her head to study the page before adding another line. Tonight's creation was something wild, a lion, but not just a lion. Its shoulders were broad, its mane flowing like a storm of fire, but from its back rose wings, powerful and defiant, each feather etched with care. It looked like something born of dreams and courage, something that shouldn't exist but somehow did, because she willed it to. Mark watched her, his heart heavy and light all at once. He could see the change in her now, subtle but undeniable. She wasn't hiding her drawings anymore. She wasn't shrinking when the world pressed against her. She was creating as if her very breath depended on it, and he realized that maybe it did. His gaze drifted past her to the faint outline of the attic window above. He thought of the guitar gathering dust up there, strings broken, case worn thin at the edges. Once it had been his lifeline. He had begged his father for it, promised he'd play every day. And he had at first, late nights with aching fingers and calloused palms, notes filling the silence like prayers. But then came the voices, the laughter, the doubts whispered by classmates and magnified by his own insecurities. The guitar became too heavy to carry, too fragile to risk, and one day he had put it away, telling himself it was only for a while. That while had stretched into years. He thought about the way Emily's face lit up when she talked about her sketches, how her entire body leaned into the story as though she was living inside it. He thought of the red word that had nearly crushed her, and how close she had come to setting her fire aside the way he had abandoned his strings. The thought made his chest tighten, but then he looked at her again, at the small furrow between her brows, at the lion's wings growing fuller under her pencil, and he knew something with absolute clarity. She was not him. She would not bury her gift, not if he had anything to do with it. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him, and whispered into the soft air, more to himself than to anyone else, "They'll never take her light." Emily glanced up briefly, her eyes curious, but she didn't ask. She smiled faintly, as if she had heard something in his voice that reassured her without needing words. Then she bent back over her drawing, shading the arc of a wing, the page filling with her vision of strength and flight. Mark leaned back against the railing, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't need to be the musician he once dreamed of being. That chance had passed. But through her, he had been given another chance, different but no less meaningful, a second chance to fight against the silence, to guard the fragile flame of belief, until it grew strong enough to burn on its own. He opened his eyes again, watching her work as the last light of day faded into night. The lion with wings stared back at him from the page, fierce and untamed, as if daring the world to try and cage it. He smiled, a quiet, grateful smile, and let the thought settle deep in his bones. He wasn't the boy who had given up anymore. He was the father who would never let her dreams be silenced. The weeks that followed felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had lifted from their small apartment. Emily still carried her sketchbook everywhere, but now it wasn't clutched like a shield. It was opened more often, shared more freely, her pencil leaving trails of creatures and worlds across the pages without hesitation. Mark watched it happen in quiet awe, the shift from doubt to belief, from hiding to creating. And though he never said it out loud, every time she picked up that pencil, he felt like he was watching her rise a little higher. One evening, the kitchen table sat between them, the same table that had once borne the weight of her tears, her doubts, her whispered question about being good enough. The lamplight spilled across the worn surface, illuminating a fresh sheet of paper she slid carefully across to him. Mark looked down and froze. It was another phoenix, but not the same one. This one was bigger, bolder, brighter. Its wings stretched wider than the edges of the page, feathers exploding in shades that seemed to crackle even in graphite. The flames beneath it were no longer timid strokes. They roared upward, alive and unashamed. The creature stared out from the paper with a defiance that felt almost human, as though it knew what it had survived. Emily's voice was soft but steady. "This one's for you." Mark's throat tightened. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing over the lines she had drawn. He traced the curve of the wings, the sharpness of the beak, the fire that seemed to leap off the page. His eyes stung, and for a moment he couldn't find words. "Why?" he managed finally, his voice rough. Emily tilted her head, her braid falling over her shoulder. "Because you didn't let me believe lies," she said. "You taught me that trash can burn, but fire, it rises." The words struck him harder than any compliment, any recognition from strangers or galleries. They carried weight, not just because of what she said, but because of what she had learned. She had taken the cruelty meant to bury her and turned it into a lesson, one she would carry longer than any ribbon or trophy. Mark swallowed hard, blinking quickly as he set the paper back down. He stood and moved around the table, pulling her into his arms before the tears could fall. His embrace was fierce, almost desperate, as if letting go might undo all the healing that had come since that first day she whispered, "Daddy, they said I'm trash." He held her, her small frame pressed against his chest, and whispered into her hair, "You're my fire, baby, always." Emily hugged him back just as tightly, her arms wrapped around him with a strength that surprised him. For a long time they stayed like that, neither moving, the sound of the refrigerator humming softly in the background, the faint scratch of graphite smudges still lingering on her fingers. When he finally pulled back, he looked at her face, those eyes too wise for 9 years, that small smile blooming shyly at the corners of her lips, and he realized something. The lesson hadn't just been hers, it had been his too. She had reminded him of something he had forgotten long ago, when laughter and labels had silenced his own music. She had shown him that it wasn't too late to rise again, in a different way, for a different reason. Mark cupped her cheek with his rough hand, his voice low, steady, certain. "And nothing," he said, "no, nothing in this world will ever put that fire out." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening but clear. She picked up her pencil again, flipping to another blank page, ready to draw something new. Mark sat back, watching her, the image of the phoenix still glowing in his mind, bigger, brighter, unbreakable. And in that moment, holding on to his daughter and the fire she carried, he knew the final lesson was not about art or contests or even triumph over cruelty. It was about truth. Trash burns, fire rises, and together they always would.